Thank you so much for joining me in this interview. I've been following your channel for a while, as you know, and I've been particularly impressed by your research. Could you please introduce yourself and your channel to whatever extent you feel comfortable with?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Noj Rants, and my channel is primarily about the Soviet Union. My background is actually in Soviet history from a cultural and mass media perspective. And I also touch on modern Russian history in general, related topics, and occasionally a flag video or two.
And can you explain what you mean by a flag video?
Oh, yeah. So when I first started the channel, my first video was actually about when Wikipedia has the wrong flags. And it kind of went from there. So even though I'm actually not a big flag person, I've kind of become known for flag videos as well. But since then, I've kind of taken the channel more towards Soviet history just because that's what I know more about and am interested in.
That's a pretty niche area of history. What drew you to it?
Yeah, so I've always been very interested in history in general, but I began making the shift towards Soviet history over the last several years. I think just because it's such a unique experience and moment in world history, right? Where you have all these different confluences of cultural and philosophical and ideological experiments for the first time, which to me just makes for a very exciting case study in the history of humanity. And secondly, it's also a history that is still influencing us today in a lot of ways.
Given that this history is so contested, could you please describe your research method and what quality control measures you take for your videos?
Yeah, so as you said, it can definitely be a very controversial history, but fundamentally, it all goes back to the evidence and trying to create a model that most accurately takes into account all the different pieces of evidence rather than starting from any ideological preconception. So, something that I try to keep in mind and encourage in my videos, hopefully, is a good epistemological process. And what I mean by that is it's not just about having sources, right? But also being able to interpret the sources. And it's not about imparting facts onto the viewer necessarily, or perhaps not solely, but also an understanding of how to arrive at those facts and evaluate facts. Uh, and this is the historical process that I think a lot of YouTubers or people in general tend to underappreciate because it's not just enough to be right, it's also about how you arrived at being right. So, to give an example, you have something like the Lenin's Testament, which was this document supposedly dictated by Lenin toward the end of his life, saying to remove Stalin from power. And now, of course, Stalin's supporters would have said that this document is fake. Well, as it so happens, there's modern scholars now, such as Stephen Kotkin, for example, who's by no means a pro-communist scholar, who have also questioned the authenticity of this document. But that's because he did the work and found the documentary evidence, or lack thereof, to assert why it lacks authenticity. The other person might also happen to be right in this situation, but from a process that is not liable to be producing reliable conclusions in every other time. So basically, what I'm saying is, I'm trying to communicate the process of how we arrive at these conclusions rather than starting from any ideological assumption or preconception. And hopefully that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely. So, when you go about your research for a particular topic,
Mhm.
where would you start? For example, would you start with the primary, secondary, or tertiary sources? Or does it depend on the topic?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the topic. More broadly, every video tends to begin with a question, whether that's a question that I'm curious about personally, or maybe a thesis from an article that I've written in the past, so I already have something to draw off of, or someone else's article where they brought up a point that also sparks interest. But a question that leads to a teachable moment or illustrates a point that I think needs to be illustrated.
Okay, so can you give me an
Then
example? See if you can walk me through that process.
sure, yeah. So Well, in the most recent video, for example, the Kraut response video,
Yes.
which I'm sure we'll get to in more detail, I had already been considering a video on the Tatar-Yoke thesis in general. It's something that I'd written about in the past, so I already had a repertoire to draw off of. And it's an example of an argument that has been repeated over the years, over the centuries, and yet doesn't seem to have been adequately explained or pushed back on YouTube from what I could find. But in general, I would say I start by doing a survey of the secondary sources. And from that, I'm sort of getting an idea where the consensus is arriving at. And from there, it's usually leading me to the primary sources. Because at the end of the day, we're basically taking these different pieces, these data points, and these different perspectives, and constructing a narrative, so to speak, that adequately explains and takes into account all the available information we have. And secondary sources are leading you to these data points and adding perspective on them for things that you didn't even consider. So in responding to that video, for example, what I found is it was ignoring too many pieces of evidence that complicated the argument. So, for example, it suggests the idea that the Rus lacked this idea of legality or a formal legal system like in the West. But that is contradicted by the law codes and the edicts and these birch bark documents that we've only discovered in the last several decades. But there's thousands of these documents which contain legal proceedings or hints of mores, which can't be squared with the assertion that they lacked legality in the way you're describing. And on the other end, you start to consider how the Western countries you're comparing them to weren't as dissimilar as you might be implying.
When you were listening to Kraut's video, how did you go about checking his facts, verifying his arguments?
I don't mean to just trash him specifically. Just
sure, understood. Yeah, it's just
it's a problem emblematic on YouTube across the board, really. But in that case, what I did was I found his sources and I read through each of those, and then that starts to give me the idea of, okay, this is where he got that from. This is where that line's from. And these are the points that his sources make, but he left out, which can affect the conclusion. And then here are the points where his sources maybe contradict what he said in the video. And then these are the things that the sources themselves left out or were unaware of. And then as I'm starting to understand his argument, I'm asking myself questions like, what evidence would I need to see to believe this point? Or what questions do I have on this line? And that's showing me what I need to research and leading me toward more sources, which then answer those questions or help me understand the argument better. And it's leading me to more recent literature, which talk about things that his sources probably weren't aware of, or we can now augment their conclusions. And so it paints a picture that better encapsulates and builds off all the work that we now have.
On a topic like, for example, the Katyn massacre or the famines in Ukraine, to be particularly diplomatic in my terminology, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where do you start your research?
We're jumping right into the controversial ones, huh?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, first I get my orders from the CIA, and then
yeah.
But you brought up a lot of good points there, actually, that the first thing I want to say is an old source isn't necessarily valueless, but you just have to always keep in mind how it could have been displaced by new evidence or augmented by new arguments since then in a sort of standing on the shoulders of giants kind of way. But it could still have points that remain true or help you make a new argument, and so you still find value in it in that way. And then in regards to the Soviet archives, I just want to say that, so usually a field of study is rarely overturned in its entirety, right? We are refining and building on previous arguments, occasionally finding new information and new evidence. And this was perhaps one of those rare moments where, because of the sheer amount of information and opportunities being offered, it allowed for such a rapidly evolving revision or refinement of previous arguments, depending on the topic, like with the famines, as you pointed out. That's a subfield that could readily take advantage of archival data and was hoping to, even before the archives were open. So, to give a little credit to the previous historians, in some cases, they were preparing for and awaiting new information to answer the questions that they had. And for when it was available, they made use of it. So now every work effectively must contend with this new data. And there's also been a lot of work since the 90s, especially by Russian scholars, to make this information as readily available as possible. So there's quite a number of collections out there that you could check out, especially by Ross Penn is the publisher. And there's also some English translations of archival data as well. One that comes to mind is there's a book called Revelations from the Russian Archives by Conker and Bachman that listeners can check out if they're curious. But all this to say, ensure that you're relying on sources that take advantage of this new information and aren't just rehashing the old arguments. And now to answer your question finally, one thing to keep in mind is to always approach every source when researching, or really in life, with a default amount of skepticism, and skepticism that's appropriate to the type of source, in the sense that you don't accept anything blindly or automatically. But on the other hand, one person can't know everything, right? We have to delegate or trust in experts, not ipso facto, just because they call themselves experts, but because they demonstrate their expertise and because they open themselves up to scrutiny so that other experts who also have the experience are mutually verifying their work. So in that sense, for these controversial topics, you really want to start with what are experts saying, and not necessarily just one scholar, because something that could happen, someone will be ostensibly be citing a good source, but in actuality, it's this fringe opinion outside academia. And you brought up reviews, which can be helpful for that, because often the scholarly consensus isn't a set paradigm that you must accept. It's an evolving trend line, and there's always people pushing the bounds of the consensus. Like, for example, in the Kraut response video, I frequently cite Charles Halperin and Donald Ostrovsky, two of the more eminent scholars on the Mongol period as it relates to the Rus. And they actually had a heated back and forth at one point, which was important for the video. And in that case, you have to hear out both perspectives and find the arguments that are most effective, or something in the middle, or couch your conclusions appropriately that maybe it's an open question still. But what you notice is they're talking to each other, trying to reach a synthesis, right? They're saying he went a little too far in this regard, right? They're not saying like, this is completely idiotic.
They're not being abusive. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
basically when a review is overly completely negative, that has to give you pause. Or even if there's no reviews. Because if there's no reviews, that usually indicates, it could be a lot of things, but it might mean this is so ridiculous, why would we even touch this? So
I'm going to cite here an example particularly relevant to Soviet history, an author with whom I'm sure you are familiar,
Grover
and that
Furr.
is, oh, brilliant. I didn't even have to say it.
Yeah.
Yes, Grover Furr. Of course, Grover Furr.
It goes back to that epistemological process that I was talking about, because he really exemplifies this lack of historical outlook, where he's not approaching evidence neutrally and critically, but beginning with a certain contrarian conclusion, and then finding any way, bending whatever evidence lying to justify that conclusion. And this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about, where how do you approach someone who thinks like this and bridge this gap? It's of a similar type almost to how do you talk to a flat earther or a pseudo-archaeologist, for example, because the problem is they don't build their belief system on the same type of foundation that we're all working with. They have a conspiratorial type of process where they would say, well, of course he's not reviewed by the bourgeois academia, right? They're all colluding.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's really hard to approach someone who, because they would actually, and I've seen this called the all roads lead to Rome fallacy. I don't know if that's a thing or not, but essentially any point you could bring can be subsumed into the conspiratorial thinking. So
excellent.
you say to a flat earther, basically every scientist agrees the Earth is round. Well, they would say, yeah, I mean, they're paid by Big Earth. And so same here. It's academia is conspiring, or they all have a bourgeois tendency or whatever it might
Right,
be.
that's right.
So,
Yep.
and it's difficult because in Soviet history especially, there is this history of bias and ideological warfare during the Cold War and problems still in history of bias. I mean, everyone has a bias. When people say that now, I almost cringe just because it's this truism that's ignoring that there's different types and severities of bias, right? Like
Absolutely.
the flat earther will say, oh, well, everyone's biased. I mean, I have my bias. The scientists, well, not really. Everyone has a bias, but we're
Very
working
good.
with different evidence.
Right.
You know, so with Grover Furr in particular, you can find however many debunkings there are out there pointing out all the technical flaws and problems, especially on his atrocity denialism. But the reason why Grover Furr isn't taken seriously is not because they're all colluding against this one man who knows the truth, but because it's just not worth their time. It's not even attempting to engage with the scholarly conversation. So why would they converse of it and give it legitimacy? Especially with Soviet history, where you have this long tradition of revisionist and new school historians who are coming in challenging the old paradigm. There was constant back and forth.
Yes.
It just doesn't bear out that there's this unified front. If there was evidence proving like a Grover Furr type point, they would love that, because every historian wants to, historians want to be the guy who, I mean, you really just have to look at how there's been this back and forth and people accepting new evidence where it just doesn't bear out. But the second thing I was going to say is it's frustrating because Grover Furr will create this facade of neutrality where I can't tell you how many times I've heard something like, look, I'm just a guy with an open mind, and if new evidence comes my way, I'm willing to hear. I'm not saying the Soviets are perfect.
Right.
I mean, but then when they get into it, they kind of do think they were perfect, actually. So at least
absolutely. Yeah, I was going to mention that I've been surprised to see who, especially in leftist YouTube and in particular Marxist-Leninist YouTube, who actually cites Grover Furr. I was very surprised when I found the Finnish Bolshevik citing Grover Furr more than once in his videos.
I actually haven't looked too deeply, but just from what I've been told in the comments and been sent, he's made like a 10-part series that was sparked by one of my videos where he's called me out, and in particular called out one of the people I cited, Dr. Vladimir Brovkin, as this anti-communist propagandist and whatever else.
Right, yeah.
So, but I mean, with someone like that, I mean, how can you even respond, right? Like, it's a Finnish Bolshevik.
Right. I mean, it's somebody who takes Grover Furr seriously. You can see when someone's playing by the scholarly rules, when someone's actually following the academic process which has been established in the field. It's very easy, as a Finnish Bolshevik does, to dismiss sources. Oh, he's Western. Oh, he's bourgeois. Right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's not scholarly. That's not academic. That's manifestly well poisoning.
Well, so 2 points on that. What I discovered is some people are just never going to be satisfied. So I got the comments like, "Oh, you're citing all these Americans."
Absolutely.
So I say, "Okay, I'll cite some Russians." And they're like, "Whoa, okay, they're post-Soviet. It doesn't count." So, okay, I'll cite people from the Soviet Union. And then they go, "Well, no, that was Brezhnev. That was the Brezhnev era." Like, give me a minute.
Exactly.
And then, okay, I'll cite sources from the 1930s. And they'll say, well, that guy's cousin's babysitter was part of a Bukharinist plot. And basically, if you contradict the official line, they'll find a way to discredit it, unfortunately. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say was, in regards to what you brought up about the government involvement, which is a factor in Soviet sources as well. Something I hear a lot is, or you'll be evaluating a Soviet source and take note of a certain bias or government interference or censorship of a certain idea. And they'll say, okay, well, everything here is biased or censored. So this is something, again, that I've been trying to find a way to explain to people the differences and bridge this gap. because there are biases or there can be problems with publications coming from any country. And conversely, it's not like there was no good historians in the Soviet Union
Sure.
or that every single Soviet source has no value. So the way I've been thinking about it is there's different layers of bias. So at the first layer, you have personal bias, the preferences of that particular person. And any person could have more or less personal bias in any country. And then you have the second layer, which, especially from a Marxist perspective, you could talk about class bias, where in
Yes.
theory, consciously or subconsciously, we could say the historian is being motivated by whatever the dominant paradigm of their day is, whether that be the capitalist system in the United States or this proletarian system in the Soviet Union. And so in theory, that's a factor in both. But then there's this third layer of either implicit or explicit coercion and censorship. And if you want to argue, well, maybe in the United States, there's some examples of implicit pressure but they don't really have this same explicit censorship apparatus, which is banning certain topics or pressuring people to not even consider them. So that isn't really comparable. But then there's this fourth layer, and there's actually a word for this. My Russian pronunciation is notoriously horrible, but I believe it's partinist,
Right.
which is basically this idea that they have explicitly codified into the historiography that all historical works should be motivated not necessarily by veracity, but for the fulfillment of political ends. Meaning that it's not just enough to publish a history. It needs to be useful to the express goals of the party and to the Soviet state. And you could argue if that's good or bad or whatever, but right off the bat, that's an example of a unique type of bias that's going to be coloring any source coming out of this system, right? So
yes.
you have to be cognizant of these biases and these potential problems and try to account for them and not just dismiss any country or source of sources out of hand.
So again, this is something that I think is particularly important when you're looking at a video, particularly if you're, say, going to critique the video, when there's an obvious absence of playing by the rules, when there's an absence of disclosure of sources or a lack of critical examination of sources.
Something I've been kind of experimenting with is showing the page on screen or the full quote, even if I don't read the whole quote.
Yes.
Just because it's so easy to quote mine, like you said, and then it gives the false impression of, oh, this is really scrupulous. This is a really serious article. But in actuality, they're misrepresenting the article. Point. But they get to claim, oh, see, I'm citing good sources. But the author
citing
actually,
a source. Yeah, that's right.
The author actually disagrees with you completely.
I need to make a video on the use and abuse of sources. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of culprits I do have in mind. TIK History is a absolute classic example of someone who is well known and widely respected for his long reference lists and his extensive citations. But when you scratch the surface, you find that he is very selective in which sources he cites. He's very selective in how he cites them. And I don't think he's necessarily even trying to deceive people. I think he just generally does not know how to do history properly.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of on your point about annotating, something you can do is almost have a conversation in your footnotes and say, so-and-so has argued this, but this other person has said we need to adjust this and that. And this other person agrees with this point, but has disputed this other one. Like, that was something I actually did in the crowd video, for example, presenting multiple perspectives. So you can kind of figure out where I'm coming from. The only thing is, on the other hand, I've seen that been used to poison the well, where so-and-so's this crazy anti-communist propagandist. So,
yes.
There's a respectful way to do it, and a way that is legitimately engaging in good faith with the source, versus just saying, yeah, there's this other guy, but just so you know, he's an idiot.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you gotta be careful in that regard. But
how much have you interacted with your own audience either directly or indirectly, casually or more formally, on these kinds of topics about sources and research?
Yeah, so I've definitely conversed. I answer every good faith, non-insulting comment,
Yeah,
or at least as much as I
yeah,
can. But something I was going to say on that point is I would encourage people to check the sources themselves that the YouTuber is citing, just because you need to verify that they're not misrepresenting the source and that they're actually making a salient point based on the source that they're ostensibly citing. So that's something I encourage wholeheartedly. And to this community mutual verification.
yes, yes,
Yeah, I almost wish there was less implicit drama with these call out videos. Like in academia, there is this process of reviews and it's constructive and collaborative. So that would be something I would want to foster on YouTube, a similar environment of working with people versus more of the
right. Yeah,
the kind of
more
the
collaborative.
drama. Like, yeah,
I know, that's right. Yeah, yeah. TIK History said what?
yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, that's like what gets views, but um, and that was actually something I went back and forth on my own response because I was so concerned about even accidentally directing ire or turning it into this
Yes,
whole call out thing. Because at the end of the day, I want to focus on encouraging interest in the history. And I mean, I go into a whole spiel in there, but the point is not to attack the person necessarily. I
exactly.
mean, I
Yeah,
guess it depends on the person, but
sure.
it's more to cultivate this collaborative environment
Right.
in theory and hopefully. And I mean, these standards exist for a reason, right? They're there to protect you as the person making the claim to say this is where I got it from,
Yeah, very good point.
and it's also helping the audience to verify and learn themselves. So
Right, exactly.
it's
Yeah.
not just like some hoops to jump through for the sake of it. And one thing I wanted to bring up is it depends what you're going for. I'm completely open to people who are shooting for a certain type of video or a certain audience, kind of like how you said, because there's value in casual, entertaining content. And then there's a time and place for more academic, long form content. And so I think the standards, we all kind of acknowledge that a YouTube video isn't a paper, but there
Absolutely.
is some sort of standard. And to me, that's something that the community kind of needs to decide
Yep.
what they expect and want from their favorite YouTubers. And so I kind of nudge in the direction of a little more academic and here's something that we can do to improve. So I don't know if there's like, I don't really want to call out any particular channel, but
Yep, sure.
because I'll just say it's kind of what standards do you want to set? Because
Yes.
at the end of the day, being more academic can make your videos more persuasive and potentially more understandable to a certain audience. But obviously there's a trade-off
Yep.
where it takes a lot more effort. So, but in general, I guess I want to push it a little more in an academic direction.
Raise
So,
the bar a bit.
just all across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with that because I think, as I mentioned before, it's not about making your own channel look good or trying to compete with other channels. It's a question of, well, personal integrity for a start. You want your content to be as robust as possible, and you feel a responsibility to inform people, so you want to inform them accurately. And you also want to educate your audience, as I mentioned previously, and help them gain the tools and the understanding with which they can assess critically the content that they view so that they can get the content they want and so that they can know for themselves whether or not the content they're watching is higher or lower quality. And I think that's a contribution, a gift, if you like, to our audience, which we're not necessarily obliged to give, but which I think is a bonus, kind of extra and some added value. And I think it's just a responsible thing to do if you're a history YouTube channel, to encourage your viewers to understand that there are formal processes involved with which they can use them, which they can learn and use themselves to assess content like this, to help them get a better understanding of the content they view and to help develop their critical knowledge skills, which will be useful not just in the fields of history, but even in terms of media interpretation and interpreting anything that
Right.
they see
Yeah.
online.
Yeah.
Information literacy, basically.
Yeah. I would actually consider that one of the most pressing problems that we're facing as a society. How do we assess media, especially in the age of social media, where misinformation and disinformation can just spread so wildly?
Yeah.
That's really a big challenge.
I can't remember the media literacy video that I saw recently. I think it might have been Zoe B's video. Yes, it was Zoe B. It was Zoe B. It was about media literacy and YouTube. And the title was YouTube and the Death of Media Literacy. And I will link it in the video description.
There's this great quote by, I think it was Noam Chomsky, who said, throughout the 20th century, we had the two biggest propaganda industries telling us this is what communism is. He was saying it in more the political sense, but the point remains, two superpowers telling us this is what the Soviet Union is. In one case for a positive narrative, and the other case for a negative one. And it's the historians who were and are cutting through both of the propaganda narratives and maybe finding bits of truth in each, but moving beyond any narrative of good versus evil. There's this great book related to this called The Death of Luigi Trastulli. I don't know if you're familiar already, but
No, go ahead. Tell me about it.
But it's basically this book, I believe, by Alessandro Portelli, illustrating the process of navigating these pitfalls and problems, especially in oral history, where accounts are deeply contradicting. So in this case, you have this guy named Luigi who is apparently killed in a protest. And despite that being a seemingly simple thing to confirm, in actuality, there's this process of reconciling the details and figuring out what happened when the protesters are saying one thing, oh, the police were shooting at us, and the police are saying, oh, we never fired any shots, and almost like a detective finding the hints of truth in the conflicting perspectives. And that's just something to keep in mind, I guess, when approaching any historical topic, that there's always a million different perspectives. There's always a million different subjective evaluations. But like we said in the beginning, it's just about finding the explanation that connects the most dots. Yeah, and to be honest, I don't like to just say have sources because, as I said in the beginning, it's about interpreting the sources continually from a good procedural foundation. And maybe we're just using have sources as a proxy or shorthand for that process we've been describing. But what I would want people to take away with is actually more than have sources, because in my opinion, some of the most disinformative, harmful channels have sources, and some of the most innocuous, potentially helpful to starting someone's journey down the history path don't have the obligatory source in the description. It's almost like this mantra to prove that you're legit. But the solution isn't just going to be having sources, as we have beaten into the ground over the course of this talk. It needs to be another level beyond that. And also, just to clarify, it's not about how many sources you have. It's not about quantity. In fact, as I said to Kraut, you can make a good video. It's possible to make a good video adapting a single book, especially if you're upfront about that and say things like, as Fukuyama argues, or I'm going to be drawing this argument from so-and-so.
Yes.
You're basically upfront that you're taking this argument from someone else, and then you're representing it for a new audience, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
So thank you very much again for answering all my questions.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing more of your work in the future.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for having me.